Hi, thanks for joining us on tonight's AfterBuzz TV Olympic opening ceremony coverage. For the first time ever, we are also streaming live on the Facebook page for Black Hollywood Live. But no matter where you're watching or listening, we have a lot to talk about, so don't go away.
You're tuning into the destination for TV superfan discussion, AfterBuzz TV. And now, let the buzz begin.
That's great. This makes me wish that we had an Olympic torch right now.
I know.
It fits.
Well, actually, no, I don't.
You didn't bring yours, Steve?
I didn't. It's
What a
somewhere
disappointment.
else.
Well,
What were you
on
doing
that,
today?
and on that wonderful Olympic note, we are so glad to be discussing the Olympic coverage for the opening ceremony that just happened in Brazil. And I'm Zoe Hewitt. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Zoe Said What. That's Zoe Said What. And sitting to my left.
Yes, it is Candace Rice. You can find me. I'm most active on Instagram _Pimp Fried Rice. I'm Pimp Fried Rice on everything.
And you guys can find me on Twitter at Steve Kaufmann. That's KAUFMANN. I was actually just at the AfterBuzz TV Olympic party and wandered in here because I heard there was more food. And now I'm on the panel, I guess. So let's do this.
That's how we roll, for
All right.
sure. Now, it was definitely a long ceremony, and we have a lot to discuss. And as we get into our recap, there's some interesting tidbits of information. There were 4,800 performers and volunteers who are all involved in this show. It was designed with the theme of Brazil as a garden of the world. So I know we'll have a lot to talk about as we
Yes.
see those themes throughout. And there are actually 11,288, that's a very specific number, athletes who are there, including the first ever refugee Olympic team of refugees from Syria, South Sudan, Congo, and Ethiopia.
That's phenomenal.
It's amazing.
That's absolutely amazing.
And I have to say that if we skip ahead for just a second, when we watch the teams walk in, I feel like one of the teams we were really most excited about was that refugee team. Can you imagine what it must be
Yes.
like to be there for them?
Oh, yes. No, I think there's a certain type of a pride that you feel, kind of walking in and their background history and where they come from. I thought it was amazing. That was one of the ones I was super excited about next to Russia and USA.
I'm also excited, like refugee team, that's great. I'm also excited for the independent team, which normally that's where the refugees go. The refugees go to the necessarily independent team, which is if you're in a place like Kuwait where your Olympic committee gets suspended, you as the athlete from Kuwait shouldn't be penalized because you're the best but you happen to be in Kuwait where it's
Right.
whatever. Yeah, that's how I worded that sentence. And, so I like the independent team, but I like that there's a refugee team and then an independent team. The question is, what song do they play for the if someone from the refugee team wins a gold medal, what song do they play at the podium?
Right.
Because
interesting.
for the independent team, it's the Olympic anthem, the one we just heard. Would they play that for? I would imagine they'd play that for the refugee team as well, or would they play their former country? Would they play the Syrian national anthem?
That's an interesting question.
I would like them to win a gold medal just because I'm curious.
Just to find
Right.
out. I feel like they would play the former home anthem, but you're right. I mean, if there's no love lost.
Well,
Right.
if they're TV producers, they would, because that's a guaranteed cry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Guaranteed cry.
Well, as the show started, the executive producer of the show, Marco Ballack, and I hope I'm saying his name right, but he said that the smile is the approach that Brazilians have toward life. So in this ceremony, they're saying that even though there are a lot of social problems and a lot of crises, that's what they're going for. So as we watch the show and as we talk about it, let's discuss if we think we see that smile. So we started with a countdown. They're in the Maracana Stadium, and the floor looks roughly like a fish shape. And the countdown involved dancers with these huge silver fabrics that were being, danced around with, really, and followed by fireworks. And then we saw this sort of interesting green peace sign that was projected on the stadium floor that it looked like a peace sign, but it almost looked like it had feathers on it. Well, it turns out that represents the national tree of Brazil, the pau-Brazil tree, and the wood is what gave Brazil its country name. And it's actually on the threatened list of Brazil, and the curved shape of the stages are a nod to the famous Brazilian architect, Oscar Niemeyer. So what were your first thoughts when you
Wow.
saw this stadium? Did you feel like you could see something big about to happen?
Yeah, I like this stadium a lot. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they had World Cup games at this stadium. I'm sure they had World Cup games at this stadium. I just don't know if they had the World Cup games at this stadium. massive, huge stadium. I want to say it held in the area of 100,000. And then the LED screen that they were on top of, that was a bit of a modern marvel. To have a giant LED screen where everyone's on top of. And we'll get into some of the tricks there.
I like the colors.
There were some great colors throughout the show.
It was so much going on. The one thing for me, I feel like if I was watching it and I didn't necessarily have the knowledge and didn't do the research, I wish I would have known more about what everything represented at the moment you were watching it, so you can take it in and appreciate it for what it is and what it stands for.
And that's interesting because that's something that we talked about a lot as we were watching the ceremony, that if it weren't for the voiceover commentary that we get, there's a lot that we might not have understood with the symbolism.
Exactly, yeah.
And so the show opened really with the Brazilian unofficial anthem, which translates to a song called The Hug. It was by a Grammy winner named Gilberto Gil. And he actually played a role also in the closing ceremony of the London Games 4 years ago, and also in Brazil's bid for these Rio Games. And the song was actually the soundtrack for the opening video. And he's also credited, very interestingly, with helping to revolutionize Brazilian music in the 1960s. And he was actually jailed for angering Brazil's military dictatorship.
Oh, no.
So to avoid being jailed, he lived in exile in London from 1969 to 1972. And then the Brazilian flag went up, and they went into this sort of rainforest theme. It started out with looking at water and like amoebas and plants and life starting on the planet, and moved into the rainforest and an abundance of life in the Amazon.
Can we stop at the amoebas? Because I think we were all thinking it. I'm sure many of us tweeted it.
Yeah.
Heading into the Brazilian Games, it was a huge story that the Zika virus, that there are other types of viruses in the river that they're also like sailing and doing, the triathletes are swimming in. And I just remember, I think my exact words on Twitter were poor choice. I get how this fits into the entire narrative that they were playing. But like literally you count down to 0 and then it's pretty much cells on your giant screen and then literally giant bugs.
So I'm back and forth about that, because on one hand, I actually thought the water images were really amazing, and I liked seeing how it split up. So I liked what they were going for. But on the other hand, I do have to say I agree with you. In light of what's been going on with the virus, it was a poor choice. But how far in advance did they program all of this? So this might have been a newer thing with the virus.
It took years. It was before the virus. I don't know. I guess they decided to move forward anyway. My gut reaction was that it was a poor choice to stick to that plan.
It was also interesting because when the animal life started, we saw like a big spider and what looked like worms, and they were being controlled by people, and they were done very interestingly because they were thin, sort of, it looked like probably wood or piping, thin poles, I guess, that were brown. So when we could see them close up from the cameras, they looked great, but from further away, when we had those far back shots, they sort of disappeared a little bit into that screen. So what did you think, Candace? Did you feel like you would have liked maybe like heavier looking spiders, I guess, so we could see them better?
Well, I don't like spiders, but I think that with the images all together, they were a bit. It's kind of like if you're there and you're looking at it, it's kind of like, what's really going on. But now that we can kind of break down everything and we see it for what it was, I would say that I would have liked the visuals to be a bit more clear in how they come across. But like you said earlier, prior to the show, their budget was 1/10 of the London.
You know what? I don't have that actual exact information in front of me right now.
Possibly, but
it was a lot smaller.
Yeah,
and of course, Brazil is facing bankruptcy right now, so it's also good they didn't spend
you have to consider that they're on a bit of a budget. So when you're on a budget, you got to do what you can. So.
And so it seems cost effective. You can do a lot with a screen, so it seems very cost effective. So they also had this rainforest imagery and a huge curtain that came up in the middle of the stadium that almost looked like a maypole. It had streamers hanging down, which was great because they projected images onto it as well. And then they had descendants of the indigenous people who were there who danced with them. It sort of reminded me of a maypole dance where you weave streamers together. But what's interesting too is that they were wearing what looked like sumo type loincloths. And so I thought that was an interesting choice because clearly that's what they would wear. But it felt like one of the parts to me where a little more explanation was necessary, and where maybe if you're in the stadium, you don't get to hear about how those costumes are part of what they would normally wear. Did it stand out to you?
Like, I thought that the actual, like, you know, once the weaving was complete and they were done with that portion, I thought it was phenomenally done. I thought it was beautiful. But to the part leading up to it, I was so lost. Like, I really didn't understand what was going on. I was lost. I was totally lost. I don't know how to.
I was happily lost. But no, like, well, no, they're clearly rowing, and then the guys with the stuff on their feet, like, there's that, and then, like, once we got into the maypole thing, I was like, I think they're building the whole forest and stuff, and then they cut to commercial, which I found interesting. Like, they cut to the commercial in the middle of the presentation, then I was like, so everybody just stops? Well, I'm kidding. I'm aware. We watched it on NBC, which was on a delay. So they cut to commercial, and then they just come back right where we left off.
And the boats that you mentioned are interesting. So that's what came up right after they did their weaving. And there were these really interesting boats that how they moved across. It looked like someone, I guess, pumping them back and forth. It reminds me of like a seesaw. For anyone who didn't see it, the way you might describe it would be a seesaw being used to move forward. And so you have these boats, and they were supposed to represent slavery. So then we see people come out with long poles to represent rowing. And then probably one of my favorite images that I think was really well done is people walking sort of with blocks on their feet to also represent the chains. So slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888, but I thought that that was a great way to show it. And then as they pulled back, we saw all of the cultures coming together. They also showed Asian cultures because Brazil is also home to the largest population of Japanese immigrants outside of Japan. So how did you feel about that portion? Did you feel like it was well done with the boat, Steve?
I enjoyed that. That was really well done. That was a little easier to follow.
And then they did mention in the commentary that the blocks and the rowing was also supposed to represent the lasting effects that slavery still has on the people. And so I kind of feel like that it's very interesting because I think that we, especially in this time, mainly focus on slavery here in America and how bad it was here. And so when you hear about the slavery in other countries and the effects that it had on the people and kind of the same tragedies, I think it allows us to kind of look at things and like, you know, hey, they have this history, they have this, and they were really telling their history and their story as it relates to them today. And so I really like that because I can honestly say today, with the help of, you know, us doing background research and everything else, that I've learned a lot more about Brazil that I did not know prior to 5 p.m.
And I think you make a really excellent point that sometimes, and I don't think this is true of just American culture, but wherever you live, that sometimes we forget about things like slavery that took place in other countries around the world. It wasn't just here. So I agree that was a great sort of eye-opener or remembrance of, okay, this wasn't just part of our American history. This is really part of world history.
Exactly.
And I thought it was handled well. And, you know, for anyone who is watching the show and had the opportunity to watch, you're watching probably on NBC, which was carrying it if you're here in the U.S., but an RCA antenna is the perfect way to watch free television because it lets you sort of cut the cord to cable and watch your favorite sports and entertainment on regular networks, the main networks, NBC, ABC, Fox, CBS, when they air. And so it is completely free. You don't need to have cable or any sort of streaming service.
Whoop, whoop.
Yep, I know. It's so nice.
Cool.
And you know what? This is actually the #1 selling antenna brand. So when there are events like the Olympics, they know that they want to bring people together and they know how to do it right. You don't have to wait until the next day to find out what happened. If you're watching it on the internet, you can find out right away with your RCA antenna. Now, watching TV has never been so simple. So you get your box in the mail or from the store, wherever you bought it, I should say. And it did come with better packaging, I should say. I took it out of the packaging because for anyone who's watching as opposed to listening, I thought it'd be easy to pull out of the box, but clearly I got stuck on the cord. But this is so neat. It's really thin. It is thinner than an iPad. That's how thin it is. So all you need to do is unplug it, or excuse me, open the box, then plug it in, and you can watch network TV completely for free forever. And you can visit rcaantennas.net for a list of the free TV channels that you can actually watch with the RCA antenna. And just as a thank you for watching us on AfterBuzz and watching us on Black Hollywood Live on the Facebook page, you can also use the promo code RCAABTV40 for 40% off. I mean, 40%!
That's almost half off!
Yep, for a new RCA Sliver XL antenna, and you get free shipping on top of that, and I'm a sucker for free shipping.
Yeah.
You can purchase it online at http with slashes, the bit.ly. I have a feeling I probably shouldn't be reading it all like this, /RCASLIVR. But again, you can go to their site, rcaantennas.net. There is a limited quantity available, and it's first come, first serve. So
you better get yours now.
Yes, you should, as soon as you're done with our after show, because we definitely have more to discuss as well.
They can open up another window with us still
Exactly.
there and just
true.
create two, and then in the other window they can
No
buy the
excuses.
RCA antenna.
None.
I like that exactly.
Because there are 43
No
watching in the
excuses.
chat.
Free
I'm
shipping,
looking
discount.
At the 43 watching in the chat. If they all bought one, it's probably going to be only 12 left.
You guys need to hurry.
I don't know their inventory.
Now, as the Olympic opening ceremony continued, they had another part. I felt like they really hit two wins out of the park for me. First with the boats and showing the representation of slavery, but followed by the projection of buildings on the flat screen, which looked like they were popping up. So they had people looking like they were jumping across from building to building until they reached the end of the stadium.
And it fooled me.
Yeah.
Fooled me.
It did. So they reached the end of the stadium where they had full sets, and then they did this sort of like rock climbing thing all over the buildings. I thought that was excellent.
That was
what did you
cool.
guys think?
I enjoyed that a lot, and that it was clearly the nod to the parkour, and that it was a forced perspective onto the LED screen, so that they weren't actually running through any buildings. They were just running straight, but like playing to that forced perspective. My only question was, if you were sitting in that stadium on the opposite side, did it look really lame?
You know?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. That's a good question.
We should find some. I'm gonna go try and find some pictures on Instagram of people who are sitting on the opposite end. Like,
I don't know. It looked cool. I was, you know, I'm a bit slower, so I was like, oh my God, that's so dangerous. How are they doing that? And then, you know, he was like, oh wait, it's a screen. But I think, didn't we discuss that maybe it was like the symbolization of like the infrastructure and you know, the building, and so you move forth from the mother nature aspect, and then you're going into buildings and you know, all of that fun stuff that ruins nature. So
No, you're right. And yeah, sorry.
yeah, and so I there was specifically a moment where they were rock climbing, which is very difficult to do while dancing, and then they were like doing splits and acrobatics, while holding the
They had like rock climbing handholds.
exactly,
attached.
and like nobody was on nobody was really
And
safe.
safety
I don't know what to call it, but
the safety wire.
Yeah, like nobody was on the safety
Harnessed.
wire. So basically, like, this is really dangerous, So I was kind of
They're
waiting.
professionals,
I was
though.
kind of waiting on a slip up. I was like, so.
they've been planning it for 4 years. They were
That,
Cirque du Soleil performers.
Yeah.
It was or at least a choreographer from Cirque du Soleil.
oh, okay. Oh, well then Cirque du
I mean,
nobody should
presumably.
mess up.
And presumably, too, they weren't that far off of each platform because there were different levels. But what I found really interesting also is that their perspective was very interesting. So it really looked like the people were much larger proportionately at that point than the buildings. So it reminded me of, I guess, like swarms of ants going up buildings. That's what I thought of. And they went from there into the first flight, which is very interesting because it's been a long source of debate in Brazil.
Right.
And so most people do say that the Wright brothers were the first ones to fly, and they are, of course, Americans, or they were. But in Brazil, they say that Alberto Santos Dumont is actually the first person who took flight. And what the Wright brothers invented was actually called, they say, a jumping machine. So to pay homage to him, they had a small plane that appeared in the stadium during that portion of the opening ceremony, and it sort of flew out, and it showed us where Brazil began sort of modernizing. So do you think that was...
They threw shots. they threw real deal shots. Like, I didn't think that had to be a part of it. Because, I think they knew the type of the stirrup that was going to happen from that. And then obviously, who are you attacking? You know, like.
Yeah.
Let me know in the comments because I haven't had time to research it. Are they right or are we right as Americans?
Well, I suppose it'll be a source of debate.
Because the claim is that the Wright brothers, they're not disputing that if the Wright brothers claimed they flew when they flew, that they were the first people to fly. They claim that the Wright brothers had no witnesses. And so meaning that they rightfully can claim we were the first people to fly with witnesses.
Well,
that's factual.
From what I read and understood, it's that, and based on what they're saying, that they say that what the Wright brothers invented wasn't actually flight. So they are saying it took place earlier, but that it wasn't actually flight.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know. It's a question of semantics, I guess, at that point. But
That's actually even worse.
Yeah. I agree. I thought, you know what? That's an interesting choice. It's clearly something that the Brazilians are very proud of. So, of course, they should and would want to include it in their opening ceremony. But at the same time, it's interesting because it is sort of a potshot at another country that is coming to the host country. And so that's sort of a funny thing for a host to do.
Alexandre Bulhos in the chat, who is joining us from Brazil, says the Brazilians are correct. Also, thank you for joining us from Brazil.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Now, after that, we saw what was considered in the commentary that we heard on NBC, Brazil's most famous export, Gisele Bundchen, walking across the stadium.
Not a human at all.
We had a really interesting discussion about that here when we were watching, that it was an interesting choice of words from the NBC commentary to call her an export versus any sort of person.
I didn't like the word.
But when you're a model, you make yourself a brand, and I think that's what they meant. The brand that is Gisele Bundchen. The commodity she made herself.
I get it. I know that they don't mean any harm.
They don't mean to say that people should be sold, because they did a whole thing explaining that that's bad.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that they didn't mean any harm by it, but I just kind of don't like the word export.
Agreed.
I just wish they would have said, like, you know, like the face, or there's a better way to describe a human being as beautiful as she is with better than the word export. You know?
Tom Brady's wife.
And even if she weren't beautiful, and you make a good point, because when we were watching, I said, oh, well, I understand, like, I've heard that term used before, but I completely see what you're saying. Yeah. And after that, I spent the rest of the time watching, thinking, like, yeah, that is sort of a strange way of speaking that we do use sort of more colloquially, but it does bring up a sort of different way of thinking of things. Well, following Gisele, who really didn't do much, to be honest, other than walk across a very long
stadium. Right
across
that.
Yes,
Great job walking.
Also, I do want to jump into the word export, because this came up earlier, that when people talk about how this ceremony was kind of like, well, it was a bunch of stage work and then some samba and then obviously the big parade part. And like people were comparing it to the London one last year, which is people would talk about more and find more entertaining because it's Daniel Craig jumping out of a plane.
Like that wasn't the highlight for me.
But it's Mr.
Bean.
It's like there was so much happening in that one because London, much like America, much like the United States, has an export that is media.
Yeah.
To get back to the word export.
Yes, exactly.
One of our only pure exports as a country is media.
Yeah.
So when we get the Olympic Games in 2024, which we do not have yet, our Olympic Games, our opening ceremonies are going to be so dope.
And what you say is such a good point, because you're right. If you're talking about a country where one of the things that the country is known for is media, you are going to get a very different ceremony, because that's what this ceremony is. It's all about media and putting on a show. And you made a great comment too, Steve, that if India did an opening ceremony, we would see an amazing show.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great point. And then it also makes me think, well, then let's give Brazil a few extra credit points for their opening ceremony, because you're right, this isn't something that they normally do. And being put on a national stage, an international stage like this, there has got to be so much pressure on them to deliver. Well, following this, we wound up with a lot of dancing, and they had sort of a music square-off with a Rio-born composer and a Rio-born rapper, followed by a young 12-year-old girl who's a known rapper in Brazil. She's MC Sofia, and her rapping specifically challenges racism and sexism. And the song that she was performing, and excuse me if I'm saying it wrong because I don't speak Portuguese, is Menina Pretina, and it actually means nightshade girl, and it's about her being proud of her skin color. And at the same time, they had a really interesting visual of someone who did what looked like to me to be capoeira on the floor that was really projected into huge form.
It was beautiful.
So yeah, I thought another great part of the ceremony, really beautifully done.
And I loved the pink hair. The pink hair was cute. I loved it.
I loved all that too. That was just, it's good to see. I always enjoy seeing what a pop star looks like in another country.
Yeah, I do too. I like
It's just a lot of fun to just be like, what? Every now and again, I'm on those websites to just kind of give you the stream of what's happening, and I just like to watch a random TV channel in a random country. Like, what are you guys into? What does a commercial look like? What does a pop star look like? What does a music video look like? What does a song sound like?
Well, it says a lot about a country's culture, and I think that it also says a lot then about Brazil's culture that, right, as we were talking about earlier with the slavery that we had sort of not thought about on an international stage for a while, that now we've got a rapper who apparently is famous enough there to be part of the opening ceremonies who is rapping about racism and sexism. And that's something that I feel like here in the U.S. we haven't quite caught up to. We don't have really huge pop stars where their main lyrics, right, are about those topics, those heavier topics.
Yeah. No, and I agree with you. I mean, you have some that like cover it and they brush over it, just to get the media attention just because of, like, oh, this is hot right now. Like the Black Lives Matter thing is hot right now. So, people will rap about it because it gets eyes. But to actually have an artist that caters to that, no, I don't think so. I loved it. I thought it was cute. I thought she was cute,
And I have to say, too, then, like, Brazil, I feel like I want to give them a little more credit, too, in saying that good for them for addressing it, because they could have not put a rapper on who's talking about racism and sexism.
Yeah,
they could have glossed right over that. So, as much as I feel like overall I was maybe disappointed with the ceremony, I feel like now that we're going over it, there are a lot of parts they did well.
They've incorporated a lot of things into it. So I feel like they really tried to add like every element to their culture from beginning to, to now into it. And yeah, they put a lot in.
Yeah. And following her performance, Regina Case spoke, and she's a Brazilian actress, comedian, host, and director who is also known as the queen of pop culture. And so then we had everyone from lots of different cultures and costumes dancing together. But it led into what was a very interesting choice, a projection of atmosphere. And so a very kind of lengthy segment in the show about problems with oil and coal and harming the atmosphere and melting ice caps. And then it's followed in this show by a guy walking out who's planting a tree who actually, they say, even fools the police by breaking through the asphalt. So it's just this very interesting commentary that turned from, I guess, more history into a very political statement. So did you feel like that part went on too long, Steve?
No, I thought that went on the appropriate amount of time because they did understand that they had the world stage and what they couldn't or didn't want to do when it came to the actual theatrics. They were like, no, we have the world stage. We have a chance to say, as the keepers of the rainforests and ultimately feel the need to protect the rainforest, protect the world.
Yeah.
That while they have the world stage, this is the biggest single problem we will face in our lifetime, and we're not doing a very good job.
Yeah. Right.
And they showed us. I like how they started with Florida, because that like in our lifetime, that's not an unrealistic projection to just see Florida underwater, and that should scare some people.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that when they show Rio is probably one of the least affected from all the charts they showed. So it's actually a little selfless from them, where they're like, no, we still think this is a problem to humanity, not just our country.
Well, it makes me wonder if something like that happened in the U.S., what the commentary would be afterwards, because I think a lot of times when someone does try to use a more public platform for a political statement. And what comes to my mind would be like the Academy Awards, which aren't inherently political, that there's some backlash of saying, hey, this isn't really a political event, of course, balanced with people who say, you've got this world stage to look at you, great for saying something. So I'm curious then also what the results will be in Brazil tomorrow, what people will be talking about.
Well, I mean, it's a good message. You know, it's not anything bad. It's not like, you know, like I hate you, I hate this, I don't like this speaker, this, and that. You know, it's a good message. So, you know, and you can't really say anything like bad about it, to be honest. You know, like, oh, save the trees. Like, what can you say bad about that? You know, so do I think that it should have been shorter, or, you know, the whole thing was long. So, I mean, would it really made a difference?
Then we got that peace sign with the tree again.
Yeah.
It did, you're right, and it did feel a little bit long, and it's interesting with some of the comments from the chat, people have been watching, it sounds like you guys have been watching in so many different places, from so many countries and over so many networks. It's so fascinating to me to see how all of us have seen and heard different things, and we'll definitely talk about that more a little bit towards the end, because there were some parts that were cut out of our American coverage of the ceremony that we had seen written up that we know were taken out, that I'm sure you guys maybe saw in your coverage. So it's fascinating to me that it sounds like some people on, I think, the Canadian broadcast channel did not get to see the rappers. And so it's interesting who cut what out. And of course, we don't want to say that anything is done for specific political reason, and sometimes people have to go to commercial, but it is interesting how things are covered in different ways.
And Rido Boy 94 said BBC had no commercials.
What?
Which means there was a much shorter ceremony.
And I feel like a lot of people in our chat, actually, we have a pretty international chat, they're saying what I'm hearing mostly is that they watched on CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Channel, or the BBC, which apparently aired it live as it happened, which on our time, which would have been 2 or 3 p.m., something like that.
So interesting.
And then they got it with no commercials.
That's fascinating.
No commercials?
But apparently, and Montserrat Geraldine, he's joining us from Mexico. We have a very international chat.
Which is
Keep
great.
It up in the chat.
Yes, I love that. And, you know, I was mentioning to these guys before the show, one of the things that I found fascinating, you know, getting off a little bit, is I lived in Japan and I went to school there and studied abroad. And I can't remember which Olympics it was, but it was during one of the Olympic years. And it was fascinating with seeing how the Japanese covered the Olympic ceremonies differently than the U.S. because our countries excel in different sports. So you see different sports on TV. So it's just fascinating how different countries cover things. And now we're getting that as well, talking about just even the coverage from the opening ceremony. So at this point, the countries began to walk in. We had the Parade of Nations. There were 207 countries represented. And one of the really fascinating things is for the opening ceremonies, they alphabetize based on the local language. So, of course, it was Portuguese. So, for example, the United States of America in Portuguese translates, and again, I'm sorry, I don't speak Portuguese, so I might get this a little off, but Estados Unidos de America. So, basically, the U.S. entered with the E's, and we entered number 69 out of the 207 teams. And so for anyone who didn't get to see it, leading the teams was someone on a bicycle. The bicycle was really brightly colored. It had plants on the back. And overhead was sort of a spinning sign that was attached to the bike. And the sign said the name of whatever country they were leading in. Also walking with the teams, there's of course the typical flag holder from the team, but also a child with a small tree in a pot. And those actually have to do with Brazil's hopes to highlight sustainability, which we talked about earlier, of course, as well. And the organizers of the games gave each of the 11,000 plus Olympians a seed and cartridge of soil that they were placing in the mirrored towers that were lining that walkway area. And at the end of the ceremonies, they'll be taking those cartridges to Deodoro to form what they'll be calling the Athletes Forest. And out of those 11,000 plus seeds, there are actually 207 different species of trees that will be planted, one for each of the delegations at the Games. So it's a massive sustainability and environmental awareness effort for these Olympic Games.
That is phenomenal. Yeah. This is well thought out.
It was. And that is a nice detail that we haven't seen before. And I also really like that it brings all of the countries together doing something.
It does. In the walkout, although I thought it was, you know, we had to watch the whole thing, so it was a bit long. I was mostly entertained by looking at the pride that everybody takes in their country, and the colors, and their not uniforms, outfits, or everything that comes into taking pride in your country and in your sport. I love that, and I think that was what was happiest to me with when USA came out, and I was just like because we have so many different faces and so many different cultures and backgrounds, and I thought that was, to me, the coolest, not just because it's USA, but because we have so many. It's a crazy melting pot here. Yeah. And as we walked out, there were so many of us that wore the same colors but had different skin colors, different hair. There was a girl there with with blue hair, and we represent that standard of all of us coming together for greatness.
And that's what the Olympics represent. And I have to say that it makes me feel not just patriotic for the U.S., but more like, I don't know, there's not even a word, like world patriotic. It just is really a nice feeling of everyone coming together. And I'm not athletic myself. I'm not super sporty, but it still gives me that feeling of coming together. And I love that. And I think that especially with the seeds and where they're looking to go from here, I love that it's going to be a continuation of staying together and growing this forest. What did you think?
I really enjoy that. And I actually really like the walkout. Like, a lot of people tend to not enjoy the walkout as much. I think it's really cool because sometimes that might be the only time you've ever heard of that country. And I'm not saying that, like,
Definitely.
And I'm not saying I'm not worldly as much as just there are so many countries.
207 were represented.
Yeah, there are 207 countries in the Olympic Games, and that's not even all the countries in the world. It's most of them. But
well, it's actually even more than the countries, I guess, because we're taking the independent team and the refugee team.
So 205 countries and the two different non-country teams.
But yeah, you're right, absolutely.
And it's important to just kind of. It's also important because I think a lot of people who just go about their lives really lose sight of some stuff. Like, I was sitting with a lot of people, and a country came out, and they had, like, it says their population, and then how many athletes they sent. And then they're just like, yeah, this population is 2.5 million. And I'm like, 2.5 million, what is that? And I had to realize I didn't know the population of each state in America.
Yeah.
To understand that 2.5 million is like, I think that's 2 Rhode Islands. Wow. Is what I learned. And then I started, every time a country came out, I started doing the math of like, well, that country is like Texas.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big country.
Well, it is a fascinating way to put it in perspective. And of course, for us being from the U.S. and for so many of the international viewers and people chatting with us now in the chat, everyone's going to have a different perspective. But the point is, it's fascinating to see how many countries there are and the size that's so different. And we were laughing too and saying it would be great if you only sent like one person and they did well, because then you could say you won 100% of your medals at the games. And one interesting factoid that we got, at least from our commentary here, was that one of the athletes from Guyana actually learned that they made the team from the Olympics Facebook page. They had not actually been notified yet. So I thought that was
that's incredible.
Excellent.
That's amazing.
Yes. Or maybe not so excellent, right?
Oh, yeah.
He's there.
He's like,
you're there.
Okay.
He's there. That would really suck if he found out like this morning. And he's like, I can't make it to Brazil, guys. Why didn't you call me?
Like, no one could text me? Like, a FaceTime?
It's like a DM on Twitter?
Something.
And it's so funny, too, because there are so many times we talk about, like, even as we were watching the ceremonies here at AfterBuzz, talking about, oh, where were you during the last Olympics? And so this is like, where were you when you found out you made the Olympic team? Oh, well, I was surfing the Facebook page. So it's great. So at the end of all the teams coming in, and of course, Greece always walks first because as the founders of the games, and then the home country, the host country, walks last. So of course, in this case, Brazil. But at the end, it was beautiful. They took all of these mirrored containers where the athletes had been placing their seeds, and they moved them to form the Olympic rings. So at that point, it looked like you had the Olympic rings all in silver. But then they actually opened them up, so we see plants inside, and they continue to open them. And so it's just greenery, so completely green Olympic rings, and they shot off green confetti. And the greenery was supposed to represent the depleted rainforests that are going to be transplanted, but it was just a gorgeous shot.
It was
and
beautiful.
I thought they did a stellar job. And it might have been long for those of us watching with commercials, but it felt like, oh, you did it. This was a great wrap up.
Yeah, no, I thought it was absolutely great. I now see what, Brazil really cares about, the plant thing. That was just kind of like the foundation of the entire opening ceremony. So, although it was long, they had a lot of phenomenal moments towards the end. So it was kind of like, it was worth it. You made it to that climax, and
Also,
great.
there's a lot of, I'm pretty sure Tongan flag bearer is an internet meme as we speak. The Tongan flag bearer, definitely an internet meme. There was the guy with the afro who was kind of dressed like a penguin who did this.
And for anyone who's listening and not watching, this
he's doing
is sort of a shimmy.
A shoulder shimmy. I'm pretty sure he's a GIF forever. I haven't been on Reddit yet today, but I'm pretty sure he's on the front page. Send us links in the comments or hit me up on Twitter if you have any other memes. If you have any other memes or funny gifs from these Olympics, while Fiji walked out, they cut to all the dignitaries, and John Kerry's clearly on your phone. Yeah, I caught you, John Kerry.
So it is fun to see how people come out, what they're doing when they come out, and it is just a great way to bring it all together. I mean, like I said, when I saw those, first the silver Olympic rings, followed by the green and the confetti, I thought, here we are. And as we had spoken about earlier about countries and places that really specialize in media, that's, the best way to end anything is with a great ending, and that's what people will remember. So for me, that was a great ending. So I really enjoyed that. Now, that was followed by the president of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, who himself is a former Olympic fencing champion, who spoke about saying that the Brazilians can be very proud of tonight. He said that, although we're living in a world of crises and mistrust and uncertainty, the Olympics is really our answer. Everyone can compete and yet live peacefully together as one in the Olympic Village, sharing meals and emotions, and that everyone is equal. And then following that, he presented an Olympic laurel for the first time. And if you didn't see it, it really looked a lot like a trophy. And the laurel is sort of the sort of two U-shaped leaves, I guess is the best way to describe it if you don't know. And it was purple. And he presented it to Kip Keino, who I hope I said his name right. I tried to write it phonetically, but he's a two-time gold medalist from Kenya who went on to open an orphanage in his homeland.
Oh,
and
beautiful.
they had a really beautiful image right after that as well. So apparently they had taken some white kites from Brazil and took them to Kenya. And so kids who had never seen kites before had the opportunity to write messages of peace on them. They then brought the kites back. And so as they were giving this award and right after, we saw children running in, carrying and flying these kites in the stadium, all of the kites from the Kenyan orphanages that came back with these messages of peace. So I thought that was just fantastic, and what a nice detail. Did you guys love the kites as well?
Oh, I mean, how can you not love it? Like, that's amazing.
No, I'm a mean and terrible person. I hated everything about this. They shouldn't have given that Kenyan man a medal
right.
or an award.
But to comment on what he said about everything being peaceful among the Olympic Village, I really truly wonder how true that is. Like, with there not being special treatment, like I'm pretty sure like the people that are very decorated in their awards throughout the years of their career, like I wonder like if there's any separation behind the scenes or
like in the Olympic Village, like if certain athletes are treated better than others.
Yeah,
like I feel like from what I read about the Olympic Village, it's a really, really fun time for a bunch of 18 to 20 somethings.
Yeah.
And if you Googled it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, I imagine also it must be a little bit like seeing a celebrity. For instance, Michael Phelps, who is the most decorated U.S. Olympian, I believe, are his credentials. This is his 5th Olympics. It's hard for me to believe that a swimmer who's there from the U.S. or maybe anywhere else, because Michael Phelps is well known internationally, wouldn't see him and want to go up to him and say, hey, I'm really impressed. You're an amazing swimmer. So for them, especially within their sports, I feel like it's a little bit of like seeing a celebrity.
Yeah.
I mean, I would feel that way.
Also, it's 11,000 athletes.
More than 11,000, yeah.
Like over 11,000 athletes. So if you're an archer and it's your first Olympics ever, and you're not from the U.S., there's a good chance you'll never be anywhere near Michael Phelps.
This is true, too.
You're a Russian archer, you're probably clear across the compound. And by compound, I mean compound, because that's...
It's big.
It would be a place to house 11,000 people comfortably.
Yeah.
And a little bit of tidbit of information about Michael Phelps, as long as we're on the Michael Phelps topic, is that although this is his 5th Olympics, this is actually his first opening ceremony. And that's because normally, based on the scheduling, he has to swim the very next day. So he has sat out every single other Olympic opening ceremony. But this year he was there and he carried the flag for the Americans. And once all of the nations walked in, then the Olympic flag was carried in. There were more performances. There was a children's choir. They had a dance party, singers and dancers, and the Olympic flame came in as well. And apparently there were 12,000 torchbearers who have been bringing the Olympic torch into the stadium. And finally, the person who actually lit the flame was Vanderlei de Lima, who had a particularly interesting story. He was a runner, and at the 2004 Olympic Games, he was in what would have been presumably first place, but he was actually attacked, and it pushed him back to 3rd place. So he did win a bronze medal. He was given an award for sportsmanship, but he is the one who lit the cauldron and the flame. And the Olympic flame cauldron that opened up, it was beautiful. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, if you're only listening to us, I hope you do Google it, but I will try my best to describe it. But it's a lot of gold, and there was a giant ring of gold, and off of the ring were lots of poles, and on those poles were lots of smaller balls finished at the end by a flat circle. And it turned in what would have been described, I would say, as like a wave. So it went to look like it was waving, I guess. I'm moving my hands, but I'm describing it for anyone listening, so moving my hands really doesn't help you. But it was really beautiful, and that cauldron was actually designed by an American kinetic sculptor named Anthony Howe, and it was followed by an amazing fireworks show. So again, I loved that cauldron. I thought it was gorgeous. What about you guys?
I thought the ending altogether was just wonderfully put together. It was great. It was entertaining. There was lights, fireworks, shiny things,
shiny pieces,
spinning.
Right.
And so, I think the ending was just a great way to end the opening ceremony and kind of, get a head start on the games and the competition. So. Yeah.
I enjoyed that you elevate the cauldron and you make it look clearly like a sun. But we've all seen a cauldron look like a sun before. Yeah. We haven't. That's not a thing. But the chandelier that it is, I really just enjoyed. Like, there's
That's
just
a better
something
word.
that there's something entrancing about it. I'm sure there's once again a GIF already of it. That it's just an endless loop of that chandelier.
And I could watch it for a long time. And now we have to sort of back up a little bit, because as we had mentioned, that each country and each place that we watched, whether it was BBC, CBC, or NBC, they all end in C, notice the trend, but that every channel seemed to show something perhaps a little bit differently. So one of the things that we found interesting about viewing it on NBC was that we saw write-ups of things that actually happened that didn't occur at all in our viewing. So we will just recap those for you guys, although we have not actually seen them ourselves. But there is normally an athlete's oath, and it has been taken by every athlete since the 1920. And so what happens is one athlete represents all of the athletes. There's also an oath that's taken by one coach to represent the coaches and one judge to represent the judges. So that happened, and the oath reads, just briefly, in the name of all the competitors, I promise we'll take part in these Olympic Games, respecting and abiding by the rules which govern them, committing ourselves to a sport without doping, without drugs, in true spirit of sportsmanship, for the glory of sport and the honor of our teams. So a great oath that 3 different people took for everyone on everyone's behalf. And then another very interesting detail, again, of what was cut is that Brazil, of course, right now is in the midst of a little bit of political upheaval. The current president, who was responsible for the games being sent to Brazil, has stepped down pending impeachment. And so there is an interim president right now who is a bit unpopular. And that interim president apparently did open the games and make a speech and was booed. And because of that impeachment trial and because of all these politics, fewer than 25 foreign heads of state were actually at the games, because basically the world is unsure of what's going to happen and people are scared of showing their support and not quite sure what to do and how to react. So, excuse me. So, Steve, what did you think then of the parts that we didn't see?
Actually, Lady Scaper in the chat just said that the Canadian Broadcast Network showed all the oaths, but they weren't in English.
Oh.
So if the interim president of Brazil would come and speak, but he wasn't gonna, I wasn't gonna get translation, I'm okay not seeing that. And what was he gonna say? Like, I'm sure he didn't actually say anything controversial. It was the fact that he was on the podium at all was controversial. So I wouldn't be surprised NBC cutting that. The oath, we probably should have seen the oath.
Yeah, that surprises me as well that we didn't see it, because it's, again, another coming together. But again, we watched a really long ceremony, and someone just posted, James Dawkins Jr. says, who's in the chat right now, says the NBC version we watched was 37 minutes longer than what other people were watching because of our commercials. So we had a lot of commercials, which also I think influences how we feel, because a lot of this we've said several times, it was long, and it wasn't so long if you took out almost 40 minutes worth of commercials. So...
Also, Lady Scaper is telling me that the Brazilian acting president said sex when he was trying to say success.
And he was speaking in English.
I recant my statement. I would have liked to see that. I would have liked to have seen that.
And apparently she says also he screwed up and it was funny. But I imagine, too, how much pressure must there be? He knows that his country right now is in the middle of this upheaval. All world eyes are going to be on him.
Exactly.
And he's not speaking in his first language, so I'm definitely willing to give him a pass on that.
Also, someone else in the chat mentioned that NBC primarily, for the samba dancing part, NBC primarily showed the athletes dancing. That's because traditionally samba dancing is done by women who are wearing just thongs. Well, thongs and then a top, but still totally just thongs. So when we did see that, it was clearly front on, clearly kind of staged. As a fan of thongs, I would have liked NBC to show me more.
And you actually, I think, were the one who pointed it out when we were watching. And you said, wait a minute, there must be thongs somewhere in there, and we're not seeing them.
I was like, immediately, there are like 1,000 thongs in this stadium right now. And they're showing me like that one, and they're all facing, like they're all front facing. I don't know.
That is a great point. You're right.
Is there,
I wish I could
HBO should do it next year.
Oh,
next
Lord.
Olympics. That was too much.
Olympics After Dark.
That would be our show. Do we have any final comments about the Olympics? Anything we want to add? Any parts of the ceremony that really stood out to you? Things you would have liked to see? Things we didn't see? Did see?
Is it really Giselle's last time walking like a runway ever? Like,
that's what we've been hearing. Yeah,
it's like, I really want to know.
Well, I feel like it's, Oprah has retired like 4 times, So, I mean, we don't know. Nothing's over till it's over.
On the Gisele Bundchen thing, I think I tweeted something very poignant, which was, everybody keep track of where Tom Brady is and criticize him for it.
Wait, why?
Because he can't win. If Tom Brady isn't with the New England Patriots doing training, doing like off-season training, we're going to criticize him because he's in Brazil with his wife. If he's not in Brazil with his wife, we're going to criticize him because if he is in Brazil with his wife, we're going to criticize him for not. It was just a funny thing that Tom Brady tonight literally both wins and loses, because he wins because he's with Gisele Bundchen. He loses because he can't be in 2 places at the same time.
Right. I wish I could have seen the oath, because, like, American media is petty. And so, like, when they're taking the oath and it's like no doping, and they probably would have cut to, like, Russia. And I just kind of wanted to see, like, what their faces. Maybe that's mean, but, like, that's how they do.
Well, that is interesting that normally I think the media really does try to have, like, a point of view. And in this ceremony's coverage, from what we saw, they really actually didn't. They cut the parts that would have been controversial.
Yeah.
So it is sort of an interesting balance there. And for me, I'd say that in reflecting on the ceremony, that during the ceremony I felt a little bit like underwhelmed, but now going back over it, I'm really glad we did, because I realized there were a lot of parts that I appreciated more than I realized right in the moment.
Right.
So thank you so much. This has been our AfterBuzz / Black Hollywood Live coverage of the Olympics opening ceremonies, and we are so glad that you joined us. Please feel free to continue commenting on YouTube and continuing the discussion. And as we wrap up, where can everyone find you on social media, Steve?
Everybody can find me on Twitter almost exclusively at Steve Kaufmann. That is KAUFMANN. I do a lot of shows here at AfterBuzz TV, and you can tweet at me regularly.
All right, Candace Renee Rice on Facebook, and _Pimfried Rice on Instagram, and Pimfried _Rice on Twitter.
And I'm Zoe Hewitt. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Zoe Said What. That's Zoe Said What. You can also find me on YouTube at Zoe Hewitt Hosting, where I do a weekly movie analysis show. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Have a great week ahead, 2 weeks ahead, watching the Olympics. Bye-bye.
From executive producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire AfterBuzz TV staff, we would like to thank you for listening to the AfterBuzz TV network. To watch or listen to other after shows and post comments or questions, be sure to visit AfterBuzzTV.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of AfterBuzz TV.
Buzz you later.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.